Welcome to the deep dive. We're tackling a question that's, well, it's been around for a while. Could those bright colors in our kids' food actually be affecting their behavior, their focus?
Exactly. Today we're diving into a pretty comprehensive review. It's from the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, OEHA for short.
Right. Oh, we.
And they've really pulled together a ton of research. We're talking human studies, animal studies, all trying to get some clearer answers on this food dye question.
And this review is zeroed in on specific dyes, didn't it? The ones we see most often.
Yes, the 7 main FDNC badge-certified dyes. These make up almost all the synthetic dye exposure for people in the U.S. You know them. Blue number 1, blue number 2, green number 3.
Red number 3, red number 40, yellow number 5, yellow number 6. Got it. And like I said, this isn't a brand new worry.
Not at all. Concerns about these dyes, especially linking them to things like ADHD symptoms in children, they've been talked about since the 1970s.
Wow, the 70s. So this OHR review is kind of overdue, maybe? Trying to sort through decades of research.
You can say that.
Yeah.
Their approach was threefold. First, a really systematic look at the epidemiologic research, basically the clinical trials involving kids.
Okay.
Second, they searched through all the animal toxicology literature, specifically looking for neurobehavioral effects, effects on the brain and behavior.
Right.
Third, they did what's called a hazard characterization, trying to figure out the potential risk of these neurobehavioral impacts based on everything they found.
So a really thorough investigation. Our mission here is to unpack those findings, understand what they mean, stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy.
Let's jump in. Where should we start? Maybe the human studies.
Yeah, let's start there. What did OISHA find when they looked at the studies done directly with children? What jumped out?
Well, what's really striking is they looked at 25 of these specific challenge studies. That's where kids are actually given food dyes, and researchers watch their behavior.
Okay, 25 studies.
And in 16 of those, that's almost two-thirds, they found at least some evidence of a positive association, meaning dye exposure linked to adverse behavioral outcomes.
16 out of 25, that's significant.
It is. And maybe even more telling, in 13 of those 16 studies, the association was actually statistically significant.
So unlikely to be just chance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It suggests a real pattern emerging from the bulk of the research done this way.
Were these studies well designed? Because that matters, right?
Absolutely. And the OEHA review noted that most use strong designs. Things like crossover designs, where every child acts as their own control, getting both dye and placebo at different times.
Okay.
And they were generally double-blinded, meaning nobody knew who was getting what, and randomized. These methods really help minimize bias.
Good. So solid studies pointing towards a link. How are these behavioral changes usually picked up?
The review mentioned that the associations were most commonly identified based on parent reports.
Ah, okay. Parents noticing changes in their own kids. Makes sense, they see them day in, day out.
Precisely. And if you look at the bigger picture, OEHA pointed to a major meta-analysis from 2012 by Nig and colleagues.
A meta-analysis combines results from multiple studies, right?
Yes, exactly. And that analysis also supported this link between synthetic food dyes and adverse behavioral effects in kids. They even put a number on it, estimating maybe 8% of children with ADHD might have symptoms related to these dyes.
8%. Wow. That's nearly 1 in 12 kids with ADHD potentially affected by something in their food.
It's a number that definitely makes you pause.
How strong were these effects compared to, say, standard ADHD treatments?
The Nig meta-analysis estimated the effect sizes were about 1/6 to 1/3 of those typically seen with ADHD medications.
Okay, so not as strong as medication, but still a noticeable effect for some kids.
Potentially meaningful effect, yes.
Did any studies look at dosage? Like, how much dye matter?
Yeah, the review highlighted a 1994 study by Rowe and Rowe. They focused on yellow number 5, so-called tartrazine, and they found what looks like a dose-response effect. As they increased the dose of yellow number 5 from 1 milligram up to 20 milligrams, the children's behavioral scores tended to worsen.
Interesting. So more dye, potentially more impact, at least in that study for some kids?
It suggests that, yes. But, and this is really important, not all children reacted. There seems to be significant individual variability.
So some kids might be more sensitive than others.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which leads to the question of why. OEHA mentioned a 2010 study by Stevenson and colleagues that offered a possible clue.
Okay.
They found links between certain genetic variations, specifically in genes, related to how the body handles histamine and dopamine, and a greater likelihood of having an adverse response to dyes.
Ah, so genetics might play a role in who reacts more strongly. Fascinating.
It suggests some kids might just be biologically more susceptible, yeah.
Okay, that covers the human trials pretty well. What about the animal toxicology studies? What did they add to the picture?
The animal studies provide crucial supporting evidence. One big advantage there is researchers can control exposure across different life stages, prenatal, infancy, juvenile periods, and track effects over the long term.
Things you can't easily do with human studies.
Right. So these studies have given us insights into potential long-term consequences of early life exposure, effects of single versus chronic exposures later on, impacts during adolescence.
And more.
Yeah, they've even looked at whether antioxidants might prevent some effects, and they're starting to identify actual changes in brain structure or chemistry linked to the behavioral changes.
So, digging into the how a bit more, any specific dyes pop up in the animal research?
Well, there were several Japanese studies on 5 of the 7 dyes we use here. They found behavioral effects at doses below the levels that cause general toxicity, the levels often used to set safety limits, the ADIs.
Lower than the safety limits. That
Oh.
sounds concerning.
It does, although Oisha cautioned that directly applying those animal doses to human children's risk requires careful interpretation. There are limitations.
Okay. What about U.S.-based animal studies?
The FDA actually supported some early life exposure studies on yellow number 5, red number 3, and red number 40. And those reported behavioral effects for red number 3 and red number 40 specifically.
Red 3 and red 40 again.
And more recent animal work is trying to figure out the mechanisms, like studies on red number 3 suggest effects on the serotonin system. Others, looking at red number 40 and yellow number 5, point towards oxidative stress.
Oxidative stress, like cellular damage.
Kinda, yeah, but imbalance. They've even observed associated changes in brain regions, like the medial prefrontal cortex, which is key for things like attention and decision-making.
Wow. And kids usually eat foods with mixtures of dyes, not just one, right? Did the animal studies look at that?
That's a critical point. And
Ah.
yes, some animal studies did look at mixtures, trying to mimic real-world exposures for kids.
And
Several reported effects on things like motor activity, even at doses near or sometimes below the current regulatory acceptable daily intakes, the ADIs.
so the combination might be a problem, even at levels considered safe for individual dyes.
That's the concern those studies raise, yeah. It suggests we really need to consider the combined effects.
This definitely leads to questions about the regulations themselves. How are those safety limits the ADIs actually set? What did OISHA say?
That's a major part of the review. It points out that the current FDA ADIs are largely based on older general toxicology studies. These weren't specifically designed to detect neurobehavioral effects.
Ah, so they might have missed subtle behavioral changes.
Potentially, yes. OISHA then compared the levels where neurobehavioral effects were seen in newer studies, the LAELs, or lowest observed adverse effect levels, to the levels used to set the ADIs, which are based on NOAELs, no observed adverse effect levels from the older studies.
Okay, comparing old safety levels to new effect levels.
And they found instances, specifically for red number 3, blue number 1, and yellow number 5, where the dose causing behavioral effects, the low AAL, was lower than the dose considered safe in the older studies, the NOAEL used for the ADI.
So we're seeing effects at levels previously thought to have no adverse effects.
That's the implication for those specific dyes, based on this comparison in the review,
Yeah.
both in developmental and adult animal studies.
Okay, what about actual exposure? Are kids typically eating amounts close to these levels of concern?
OISHA looked at that too, using national survey data from 2015-2016 to estimate kids' diet intake. They compared these estimates to ADIs set by both the FDA and JEFFA, that's an international expert body.
And the verdict.
For most dyes, estimated intakes were below both sets of ADIs. However, red number 3 was an exception.
Red number 3 again.
Yes. For several age groups of children, the estimated intake of red number 3 actually exceeded the JEFFA ADI, which is more stringent, more health protective than the FDA's.
So some kids might be consuming levels of red number 3 that exceed at least one international safety guideline.
Based on those estimates, yes. The hazard index was over 0.1, indicating potential concern.
Did OISHA directly compare the US ADIs to specific behavioral studies that found effects?
They did. They looked closely at red number 3, red number 40, and yellow number 5. For yellow number 5, remember that row and row human study?
Yeah, the dose response one.
OISHA estimated that the dose showing effects in that study was incredibly low, potentially around 0.04 milligrams per kilogram per day as a NOAEL, based on their calculations from the study data. That's way lower than the current FDA ADI for yellow number 5.
Much lower. Wow.
And other human studies on yellow number 5 also found effects at doses estimated to be below the FDA's acceptable level.
What about the other dyes, like yellow-6?
Data was more limited for yellow number 6, but the review mentioned a study on one of its breakdown products, sulfonilic acid, which is also produced from yellow number 5, by the way.
Okay.
That study hinted at potential neurobehavioral effects, raising a question mark about whether the current ADI for yellow number 6 is adequately protective either.
So putting it all together, the human studies, the animal studies, the regulatory comparisons, what's the big conclusion from the OEA review?
I think the main conclusion is that the overall body of scientific literature supports an association between synthetic food dye exposures and adverse neurobehavioral outcomes in children.
An effect seems likely.
Yes, and crucially, these effects may be occurring at exposure levels that children commonly encounter, which leads to the second key point. The basis for the current FDA ADIs might not be sufficient to protect children, especially those who might be more susceptible.
Right. So the safety margins might need another look.
That appears to be the strong suggestion coming out of this comprehensive review.
This has been incredibly insightful, really digging into that OISHA report. What's the main takeaway for people listening?
I think the key message is that there's a significant body of evidence now from different types of studies suggesting this link between synthetic food dyes and behavioral issues in some children isn't just anecdotal.
It's backed by research.
It seems to be, yes. And because of that, there's a real question about whether current safety levels, the ADIs, are adequate, particularly for dyes like red number 3, and for kids who might be genetically more sensitive.
And we definitely heard that point about individual variability loud and clear. It's not every child.
Absolutely not. That was stressed in the review. Some kids react, others don't seem to. And OISHA also highlighted areas where we still need more research.
Like what?
Well, things like animal testing, designed more closely to mimic human studies, better understanding of how our bodies actually handle these dyes at different ages, toxicokinetics it's called, more studies on the biological mechanisms, the role of genetics, definitely more high-quality clinical trials in children, using really well-validated measures of behavior, and also looking at the potential long-term impacts of repeated low-level exposure over time.
Lots more to learn still.
For sure. It's complex, and ongoing research is needed to really nail down the risks and who is most vulnerable.
So it leaves us with something to think about. Given these findings, what proactive steps might you consider regarding synthetic food dyes in your diet? Or maybe the diet of children you know? Definitely food for thought.
It certainly is.
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy.